Officer Clyde Marston was the kind of cop who left no rule unturned. Whether it was jaywalking or loitering, Clyde believed the law was the law, and it was his job to enforce it. He walked through Riverside Park every evening on patrol. That evening, the park was quieter than usual. His attention caught on a man sitting slumped on a bench. The man had a shaggy beard, worn clothes, and a battered duffel bag at his feet. He didn't seem to notice Clyde approaching. Clyde slowed down, observing the man. The town had ordinances against vagrancy, and Clyde had made it clear in the past that the park was no place for loiterers. He waved his hand and stepped forward. "Sir," he said with a firm tone but not harsh, "you can't sit here all night." The man looked up, and his eyes were dull. "I'm not causing trouble," he replied softly. "That's not the point," Clyde replied. "We have rules, and everyone's gotta follow them." The man didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thin blanket, as if he was preparing for the cold night ahead. Clyde noticed the small patches on the man's jacket. One of them bore the faded insignia of the U.S. Army. A spark of curiosity flickered in Clyde's mind, but he shook it off. Rules were rules. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Clyde asked, though he already suspected the answer. The man shrugged. "Not anymore." Clyde then asked him, "Name?" "Jake Holman," the man replied. "Jake, you're not supposed to sleep here." "I'll have to." "Arrest me?" Jake finished for him. He leaned back on the bench. "Go ahead if you need to." "I've been through worse," he told the cop. Clyde hesitated. There was something in Jake's tone, something that hinted at a story he wasn't eager to share. Against his better judgment, Clyde lowered his voice. "What's your story, Jake?" For a moment, Jake didn't answer. Then he sighed and responded. I served in the army for 20 years, fought in wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, a couple of places you've probably never heard of. Got out, and well, life didn't exactly roll out the red carpet." Clyde shifted uncomfortably. He asked, "What about your family?" "Had one," Jake replied. "But people get tired of waiting for someone who might not come back whole. My wife, my kid, they've got their own lives now. Can't blame them." Clyde felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't a soldier, but his father had been. He'd grown up watching a man haunted by battles he'd never fought. He looked at Jake again, really looked at him this time. "You need help," Clyde said. Jake gave a bitter chuckle. "Help is for people who have somewhere to start. I've got nothing, officer. Not even a place to sit for more than 5 minutes." Clyde didn't reply immediately. He knew he had a choice. He could follow the rules, or he could bend them. He wasn't a man who liked bending rules. But tonight something felt different. "Come on," Clyde said, motioning for Jake to stand. "I know a place." Jake asked. "You're not arresting me?" "Not tonight," Clyde replied. "Let's get you somewhere warm." As they walked out of the park, Clyde made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't going to be a one-time thing. Jake followed Officer Clyde Marston down the quiet streets of Maple Grove, unsure what to make of the man's sudden change of heart. They didn't speak much as they walked. Jake tightened his grip on his duffel bag, glancing at Clyde occasionally, but the officer's face was unreadable. Eventually, they stopped in front of an old brick building with a worn sign above the door that read Bridging Hope Outreach Center. Clyde pushed the door open. "Come on," Clyde said, gesturing for Jake to follow. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread. A few people were scattered around, sitting at tables or talking quietly. A woman in her 50s, wearing a cardigan and glasses, looked up as they entered. Her face brightened in recognition. "Clyde," she said, "what brings you here tonight?" "Got someone who could use a hand, Ethel," Clyde replied, nodding toward Jake. "This is Jake Holman. He's a veteran." Ethel's expression softened as she extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Jake." I'm Ethel Porter, the director here. Let's get you settled. Jake hesitated. I'm not looking for charity, he said quietly. This isn't charity, Ethel replied gently. It's a place to rest and regroup. No strings attached. After a long pause, Jake nodded. Ethel led him to a table where a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of sandwiches soon appeared. Jake muttered a quiet, "Thank you," before sitting down. Clyde watched from a distance, feeling an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction. He wasn't the type to get involved in people's lives beyond his duties, but something about Jake had stirred something in him. Maybe it was the way Jake carried himself, like a man who'd seen too much but refused to break completely. Ethel walked back over to Clyde. "What's his story?" she asked. "Served in the army. Said he's been through some rough times since getting out," Clyde replied. Ethel nodded knowingly. "That's more common than you'd think. We've worked with a lot of veterans here. Most of them don't ask for help until it's almost too late." Clyde glanced back at Jake, who was eating slowly. "You think you can help him?" he asked Ethel. "We'll do what we can," Ethel said. "But it's not just about food or a bed. He'll need something bigger to hold on to, a reason to keep going." Clyde thought about that as he left the center. He couldn't shake the image of Jake sitting on that bench. The next morning, Clyde found himself dialing a number he hadn't called in years. His father's old friend, Gary Lindstrom, was a retired sergeant who now ran a local program for veterans called Second Horizon Initiative. They provided counseling, job training, and connections to housing for former service members. "Gary, it's Clyde Marston," he said when the line connected. "Clyde! Been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," Clyde replied. "I've got a guy, a veteran, who's in a bad spot. Think you can meet him?" "Of course," Gary said without hesitation. "Bring him by tomorrow." The next evening, Clyde returned to the outreach center. Jake was sitting in a corner, talking quietly with Ethel. His beard had been trimmed, and he looked slightly more at ease. "I've got someone I want you to meet," Clyde said, motioning for Jake to follow him. Jake hesitated, but something in Clyde's tone convinced him to get up. They drove to Gary's office, a small but welcoming space filled with photos of soldiers and plaques on the walls. Gary greeted Jake with a firm handshake and a smile. "Clyde told me a bit about you. Why don't you tell me the rest?" Jake looked at Clyde, then back at Gary. Slowly, he began to talk. He spoke of the missions, the camaraderie, and the losses that weighed heavier than any medal he'd ever earned. He talked about the nightmares, the loneliness, and the struggle to find a place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. Gary listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When Jake finished, there was a long silence. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," Gary said finally. "But you don't have to anymore." As they left the office, Clyde turned to Jake. "You've got people willing to help you now. Don't waste it." Jake nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. The weeks that followed weren't easy for Jake, but they were different. He stayed at Bridging Hope while working closely with Gary and the Second Horizon Initiative. They connected him with a counselor who specialized in veterans' trauma, helped him apply for benefits he didn't know he was eligible for, and even lined up a part-time job at a local hardware store. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was moving forward. Clyde checked in occasionally, though he didn't linger long during his visits. Jake suspected it wasn't just duty that brought the officer by, but something deeper. Clyde never said it outright, but his actions spoke louder than words. One chilly Saturday morning, Clyde arrived at the hardware store where Jake was working. Jake, now clean-shaven and looking sharper in his work uniform, was organizing shelves. He glanced up and smiled. "Officer Marston," Jake said. "Clyde," the officer corrected, offering a rare grin. "How's it going?" Jake shrugged. "Better, thanks to you." Clyde waved off the thanks. "You did the work." I just pointed you in the right direction. They stood in silence for a moment before Clyde spoke again. There's a veterans support group meeting tonight at the community center. Thought you might want to come. It's run by a couple of guys from Gary's program. Jake considered it. Maybe. We'll see. Jake, Clyde said, meeting his eyes. It's not just about surviving. It's about rebuilding. You're doing that now. Jake nodded slowly. Thanks, Clyde. For not just walking away. Clyde clapped him on the shoulder. We all deserve a second chance. Don't waste yours. That evening, Jake did attend the meeting. He didn't speak much, but he listened. He heard stories from men and women who'd walked paths similar to his and found ways to build something new. As the meeting ended, Jake stood outside the center, looking up at the stars. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Kindly subscribe for more thrilling stories. Like and share this video. Have a nice day.